Our speaker this morning, Dr. Robert Nanima, is a professor in law at the University of the Western Cape here in Cape Town, where I am as well, and an expert on children's rights. We want to understand this morning, what are the main instruments, the main legal instruments that apply in our continent to promote and protect the rights of children. We want to understand a bit more about how well those instruments are adhered to in our various countries, continent-wide, but of course also, hopefully Dr. Nanima will point to those countries which are doing well and perhaps those which are not doing so well in upholding children's rights.
Thank you so much, Mike. I hope you can see my screen.
Yes.
Ladies and gentlemen, as I've been introduced, I'm Robert Nanima. I'm a lecturer at the University of the Western Cape, and I also serve as an expert with the African Committee of Experts on the Rights and Welfare of the Child. I also serve as a special rapporteur for children affected by armed conflict. And I should say that I was deeply moved by the prayer where we thought about children and had a meditation. I was touched by that. Thank you, Father, for that prayer. It's really appreciated. So my task is to talk about rights of children in Africa. And in engaging this conversation, I extend this to asking the question, what role can civil society play in enhancing accountability? To this end, when we speak about accountability, we're not going to talk about what it should do, what steps it should take. We're not going to break down the concept of accountability, but rather we are going to steward these children, look at some of the rights and see how we as CSO can be more accountable, can be more relevant to improving the narrative from the fact that children's rights are violated to the narrative that there's some mitigation going on through lobbying, through advocacy by civil society organizations. On that basis, I have a few expectations that I hope the participants would also allude to. And those expectations are that I expect the participants to know or to be reminded of children in their different environments. In what environments do we have children? Is it only in terms of peace or when there is war? So by way of introduction, we shall look at children and the different environments under which we find them. Then we shall look at children's rights instruments that are relevant to Africa. To not to be pedantic, not to become academic, yes, I'll give a list of various instruments, but I'll also hinge on where our conversation should lie for our discussion tonight. Then when we are looking at the key distinctions between international and international instruments and instruments under the African Human Rights System or the African Union, we shall also latch on specific instruments that I will communicate to you in due course when we reach that point. Fourthly, I also expect that we shall learn more about implementation and adherence to these instruments, looking at successes, failures, challenges, and opportunities. But I must confess to my discomfort. I don't like using the word failure. I prefer using the word challenge, such that even if there is a failure, I'm able to get up and improve. Even if there's a failure, I believe an entity should be able to get up and improve. So I'll look at challenges and failures generally as challenges, and I believe that will help. Ladies and gentlemen, you just excuse me a bit. Let me just connect my charger. I think it has just moved out a bit. Just give me a second. I should be able to. Let me just connect the charger and continue. Just a moment.
Yeah, that's fine.
Yes, I was speaking about the expectations, and I said the first expectation is about expecting the participants to know about children and the different environments. Secondly, about children's rights instruments in Africa. Thirdly, the distinctions between international and AU instruments. Fourthly, how to implement or adhere these instruments. when we are looking at some of the successes, some of the failures, some of the challenges and opportunities that arise. And finally, to locate our role as CSOs, especially in the faith sector, in holding governments accountable to realize the rights and duties in these instruments.
Dr. Nanima, if I could just ask you perhaps at the end of each little section or few sentences just to pause for the interpreter to catch up with you.
Okay, I'll do that. I have also prepared some questions for the participants. They are 7 in number. These questions are for an introspection. They don't have to answer them in the course of the presentation or even at the end, but these are questions that they should be able to have an introspection on after the presentation and later when they are in their areas of influence where they do their tool of trade. I think these questions are quite important. So the questions emanate from the participants, from the expectations. For instance, the different environments of children, the laws related to protection of children in the country, whether you know of any international laws on children's rights in Africa, the key distinctions, and 4, whether the government implements or has implemented or adhered to these instruments. Then the final 3 questions, whether participants have some examples of the notable successes, failures, and challenges and opportunities. I believe this will come out when we are having the discussions of the various scenarios or during the question and answer session. 6, the role of CSOs or civil society organizations in holding governments accountable. And 7, I think this is critical as to why we're here. The practical steps that can be taken to make CSOs more relevant to the child rights agenda in Africa. So this will be the overview of the presentation. Just like I've stated before, I'll give an introduction about the different environments, an overview of children's rights in Africa, children's rights instruments in Africa, the various distinctions between the various instruments. Then I'll speak to implementation and adherence of these instruments. Then the role of CSOs in holding governments accountable. By way of introduction, there are 3 environments that a child finds himself in or herself in. The first is a peaceful environment where there is no war, there is no tension, there is no strife, there are no humanitarian disasters, no earthquakes. That is largely peaceful, and I think to a great extent, most of the children grow up in these environments. Then the second environment is where we have children who are affected by humanitarian crises. Some of these crises might be man-made, others are natural. If you're speaking about climate change, if you're speaking about earthquakes, those are natural occurrences. But if you're speaking about armed conflict, those are man-made. They're man-made humanitarian crises where children find themselves in. The third environment is where we have children who are from these areas where there have been humanitarian crises, and they are seeking refuge, they are seeking solace, they are seeking security, they are seeking safety in places where there is some kind of relative peace. If these children move within the same country, then we have internally displaced persons or internally displaced children. If they move across borders, then they either turn out to be refugee children or asylum seekers. Some of these children are separated from their parents or guardians. Some of these children do not even move with their parents or guardians. They are unaccompanied. So these might be internally displaced persons, or they might cross borders and will turn out to be refugees or asylum seekers. There are various child human rights instruments. I would want to say from the onset that we shall only discuss the first two, because in my view, they speak to the rights of children in Africa. That will be the African Charter on the Rights and Welfare of the Child. I'll refer to it as the Africa Children's Charter or the Charter or the ACRWC. If you see anything like the ACRWC, that would be referring to that charter. Then we have the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. That's the international charter that is not only applicable to Africa, but the entire globe, the entire world. Now, the other instruments from 3 to 5, they are optional protocols under the UN Convention, meaning there are some aspects that are not in the convention itself, but they needed to deal with them. Issues such as prostitution and child pornography, issues such as non-recruitment of children involved in armed conflict, issues such as having a communications procedure, being able to lodge cases with a committee on the rights of the child. That's how these 3 came up. But otherwise, unlike the African Charter, the African Charter does not have optional protocols because everything is inbuilt within it. And that is one other distinction that we shall speak to when we are discussing the various distinctions. So then the subsequent slides, I'll simply flash them for you to see, but I'll not speak about them. I'll only speak about item 17 or number 17. But these are other laws. Once you have the presentation, you can always look at them, but they will not form part of our discussion tonight. These include slide 8, slide 9, and slide 10. Now, number 17 is the UN Convention relating to the status of refugees, or simply the Refugee Convention. This convention, much as it does not speak to children, at times the committee can use it to protect children if there are principles that it can pick from there. That's why I said I would speak about it. So now, on the basis of these instruments, just like I've said, I'm going to speak to only the first 2. That will be the Africa Children's Charter and the CRC, or the Committee on the Rights of the Child. And this will be by way of comparison and contrast. But before I do that, I would just like to mention some of the rights that are mentioned in the African Children's Charter. These rights include the right to education, the right to life, survival, and development. The right to life, survival, and development also passes off as one of the principles, the child rights-based principles for applying the Children's Charter. Others are the right to health, safe environment, and freedom of expression, association, freedom of thought, conscience, and religion, leisure, recreation, and cultural activities, protection against child abuse and torture, among other rights. This is not a conclusive list, but these are some of the rights that are therein, and I think it's instructive to have it. The presentation will be shared. So going on to the key distinctions, we start with a structural form of distinction between international instruments and AU instruments. This does not inform still the major discussion, but it is also instructive to know it that when you're dealing with international instruments beyond the African Union, if you're looking at instruments of the United Nations, the bodies that manage them inform this position. Under the UN system, we have charter bodies and treaty bodies. Charter bodies are provided for under the UN Charter. These include bodies such as the Forum on Minority Issues, the use of special procedures, the Human Rights Council Advisory Committee. Those are under the charter bodies. But we also have the treaty bodies. Now, the treaty bodies, each of the treaty bodies have a monitoring body that monitors the implementation and adherence of that treaty body, of that treaty. For instance, if you're looking at the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, ICCPR, you have the Human Rights Committee as the treaty body. If you're looking at the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, you have the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. All these other bodies that are listed here are bodies that monitor the implementation of the treaty. It's very instructive to know that, because the position is rather different when you come to the African Union system. When you come to the African Union system, at the apex, we have the General Assembly, and that is the main policy organ. At times, it delegates some of its work to the Executive Council or the Permanent Representatives Committee, the PRC. Now, when it comes to human rights, there are specific human rights organs that have been established. I'll give an example of three. For instance, we have the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, which is referred to as the Commission, and it sits in Banjul, and it monitors human rights implementation and adherence across most of the instruments, like the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, the Maputo Protocol, the Malabo Protocol when it comes into force. Then we also have the African Committee of Experts on the Rights and Welfare of the Child. When we're speaking about this, it monitors the implementation of the Africa Children's Charter. And it's for that we are speaking about today. Then we also have the protocol to the establishment of the African Court, which establishes the African Court. Now, the committee and the commission both have a protective and promotional mandate of human rights. The Commission for All Human Rights and the Committee for Human Rights of Children. The court has just a protectional mandate when it comes to promotion of rights generally in Africa. That's the difference. So for the African Union, I would say the human rights organs are rather pretty spelled out. There is one for children, there is one for all human rights, that's the African Commission. Then there is a court, that is the African Court of Human and People's Rights. So now the question becomes, in light of that structure, what are the distinctions in light of the laws that provide for the protection of children? Now, when I'm looking at this distinction, I look at only the African Charter on the Rights and Welfare of the Child, because it's the only charter that speaks extensively to the protection of the rights of the child in Africa. But it has a lot of soft law under it. It does not mean that it does not have enough jurisprudence, enough laws to use. It has a lot of soft laws under it, as we shall see. Then I relate it with the CRC or the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. And this is the global convention that protects the rights of children across the world, across the globe. But the reasons as to why the African Charter was adopted was because there was first kind of political exclusion. There were only 9 countries that were involved in the working group, in the drafting process. So as a result, most of the aspects that spoke to the rights of the child, of the African child, the lived realities of the African child were not brought to the fore. Secondly,
Nanima, sorry to interrupt you, just once again to slow down a little bit. The interpreter is struggling to keep up, especially with the terminology. So maybe just after every few sentences, a few seconds, pause.
Okay, I'll do that. And states were excluded in drafting the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And so there was a need they felt the need to have a charter that speaks to the realities of the African child. Secondly, there are some omissions in the CRC or in the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and I'll show those as we continue the discussion. Thirdly, the situation of children affected by apartheid was not discussed in the CRC, and that also became a reason to have a drafting of the African Children's Charter. Other distinctions that led to the adoption of the African Children's Charter was that factors that disadvantaged the female child were not sufficiently considered. These included factors like female genital mutilation, factors like child marriages, and factors like the issue of responsibility and duties of the child. And finally, the extended family and its role in the upbringing or upbringing of the child was not covered. So now, on the basis of that, when the Africa Children's Charter was drafted, there was added value that was evident, that puts it or that makes distinctions between the African Children's Charter and the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And I'm going to speak about that. First, the Charter defines a child as a person below the age of 18. Unlike the CRC that allows a child to be defined below 18 if national law provides so. So a person might be 16, he will be a child, and if the law says at 17 he should be an adult, the CRC allows for that. Secondly, the Charter does not allow the recruitment of child soldiers. That position was different with the CRC until there was an amendment and the protocol on the use of children, on recruitment of children in armed conflict. It did not have a provision that stopped the use of children in armed conflict, but the Charter provided so. Thirdly, the Charter protects child refugees and internally displaced children. The fourth distinction is that the Children's Charter does not make a distinction between civil and political rights with socioeconomic rights. I'll give an example. When you're talking about the right to education, the right to health, those are socioeconomic rights that are supposed to be enjoyed as the state organizes itself, gets resources to enable the enjoyment. So the enjoyment is progressive. That is the position in the CRC. But for the Charter, the Africa Children's Charter, it does not make that distinction. It calls on states to take legislative measures and other measures that are necessary to ensure the enjoyment of all rights and not just socioeconomic rights. And the fifth point is that the Charter, the Africa Children's Charter, places a duty on the child. There is no provision on the duties of a child in the CRC. And number 6, as I have indicated, the state has a duty under Article 1 to take all steps necessary legislative or other measures to ensure the enjoyment of the rights of the child. The African Children's Charter, just like the CRC, they have some comparisons. They all use the child rights-based approach. A child rights-based approach is an approach that uses 4 principles in dealing with matters concerning children. 1, a child should not be discriminated against. That's the principle of non-discrimination. Secondly, all matters concerning children, all decisions made should be in their best interest. Thirdly, just like I stated before, they both use the principle of the right to life, survival, and development. I would like to bring this to the attention of the participants or remind them that a child does not only need life, the right to life, that is hitting below the belt. A child needs the right to life. He or she needs to survive in terms of adequate nutrition, in terms of quality housing, and the child needs to develop holistically, have good nutrition, go to good schools, have a good environment. So the right to life, survival, and development is a holistic approach to the enjoyment of the right to life of a child. And the 4th principle, the child has a right to participate, or the views of the child should be considered or should be heard before a decision is made. Those are the 4 principles. And 8, this is a distinction. The child is a direct beneficiary of the right. If you look at the wording of the Africa Children's Charter, it speaks about every child has a right. Every child shall do this. Every child has this right. Other than the CRC that talks about the state shall do this, the state shall take measures. So we see this more direct reference to the child in the wording in the Children's Charter as opposed to the CRC. And the final aspect that I spoke about, the Africa Children's Charter has an inbuilt communications mechanism. If you want to take a communication against a country or against an individual for violation of your rights, and you've gone through the positions in the national law, you can go straight to the committee. For the CRC, they have another law in addition to the CRC. That is the optional protocol on communications. The problem with this other protocol is that if a country has not ratified or domesticated it, a communication cannot be brought against it. The position is different with the committee, the position is different with the African Children's Charter, where a communication can be brought because it's inbuilt within the charter. Still in line with the distinctions that the charter offers over the other laws in Africa or on the AU plane, is that it has a promotional mandate. That is to promote the content, the rights in the charter. An example is where it promotes the fact that countries should ratify, countries should domesticate the laws, should domesticate the African Children's Charter. It also has a monitoring mandate. The monitoring mandate is to receive reports from state parties and to receive complementary reports from other entities such as CSOs, such as national human rights institutions, to evaluate the monitoring of the rights of a child in a particular country. It also has the protection mandate. And the protection mandate talks about having a complaints mechanism, which I've spoken about. When you lodge the complaint, you want your rights as a child to be protected. We also have the protection mandate through letters. At times, the complaints mandate might take long. So because it might take long to be heard, it's a process that has to be followed. Some countries or entities or individuals use letters of urgent appeal. They write to the committee saying there is a possible violation of rights that will take place. Kindly engage the state not to. These letters are treated with utmost confidence. When the committee receives these letters, it then writes to the state. We have received information that you are, for instance, about to change the law, which allows for child marriages, or to change the law that affects the definition of a child. We request you not to go ahead with it because it violates the charter. That was done for a situation in Mauritius, which is a good example. Mauritius hidden, and it did not go along with the amendment. That was also done in Sudan, where a child was about to be executed, he had been sentenced to the death penalty, but because of the letter of urgent appeal, that was not done. Then we also have investigative missions. For instance, if you're saying that there is slavery in Mauritania and you have brought a case or a communication to the committee can go on an investigative mission to establish to what extent is there slavery in Mauritania. Is it contemporary slavery? What's really happening? What can we do before we make the decision on the case that has been brought before us or on the communication? So that is still in the wake of investigative missions. The protection mandate is also through research and studies. The committee does research on the protection of the child. There is a particular slide that lists the various research aspects that the committee has done. I'll talk about them when I'm on that slide. Then there is also the interpretational mandate. This is to interpret, the committee interpreting the Africa Children's Charter. Interpretation at times is by way of preparing general comments. A general comment is a document that gives insights or expands on the understanding of a particular article. For instance, Article 22 talks about the right to the protection of children affected by armed conflict. So there is General Comment 6 on Article 22. It talks about armed conflict. It talks about other instances which could amount to the same effects that armed conflict presents, such as tension. Tension is where there is conflict, but there is not, they're not using arms, or strife. For instance, if there is strife in Eritrea because of a humanitarian situation, Article 22 should be used in that regard. If there's election violence in Kenya because of people who are not happy with the outcome, much as they are not using arms, but if there is that high degree of tension, then the general comment states that the protection should not only be limited to armed conflict, but also in those other areas. Bringing it back home, if a fire breaks out in Nanima, a fire breaks out in the Western Cape, children will not go to school, health centers will be flooded, children will not have a good environment to stay. So the same protection that is accorded to children in armed conflict should also extend to areas where there are fires, where children are affected because of gang-related incidences. So that's what a general comment does. It expounds on the understanding of a particular article. And so far we have about 7 general comments. The notes are in the slides, you'll see them. And they speak to various articles in the Children's Charter. The other way of having the interpretational mandate is through days of general discussion. The committee or civil society organizations write to it to say we should have a day of general discussion about, let's say, child marriages. So that day of general discussion, all parties that attend give their understanding of child marriages, the problems on that child marriages present, and what can be done to improve the situation. So that is also taken as an interpretative guide of a thematic aspect such as child marriages. Another thematic aspect can be armed conflict. Another thematic aspect can be female genital mutilation or sexual and reproductive health and rights. So that's the interpretational mandate. Still, when I'm speaking about the mandate, I would say that the general mandate, the one that I've spoken about, is provided for in Articles 42 to 45 of the Charter. Then we also have specific mandates. I've also spoken about this, like the mandate to protect children affected by armed conflict, the mandate to protect children from practices such as female genital mutilation, the mandate to protect children from marriages. Now, those become thematic mandates, but they are also under the Charter, under the Children's Charter. Then we also have, I could call this abridged. It balances the specific, the general, and aspects that are not covered under the Charter. For instance, you might want to protect refugee children, but the particular concept that the committee wants to use is not in the Charter. So what the committee does, it looks for any other international human rights law from other sources, and it uses it, provided those sources protect the child and uphold African values and traditions. So for instance, if the committee wants to engage issues of protection of women from domestic violence, it will use the Convention on the elimination of all forms of discrimination against women, because it deals with domestic violence. And in that way, it will be drawing on inspiration. It will be drawing on inspiration from other sources. So now, in light of the distinctions that we have seen, I would summarize by saying that there is added value that the Charter brings on board, and it uses a child rights-based approach that places it in a position to protect the rights of the child. But despite this rather good picture, we have had successes, we have had failures, which I would call challenges and opportunities. Despite the glossy picture in terms of the law, this is where the rubber meets the road. What are our successes? What are our challenges or failures? And what are some of the opportunities? In terms of successes, there has been more advocacy on promoting the rights of specific children who are affected, like those affected by armed conflict. That was done in Sudan, South Sudan, and the Central African Republic, and also investigating the situation of children with albinism in Tanzania. An advocacy mission was undertaken by the committee. We also have fact-finding missions. Is there slavery in Mauritania? Let the committee visit and find out more about it. Do we see a lot of children affected by armed conflict in Sudan? Let the committee go on a fact-finding mission and establish the facts that are there. So in those countries that I'm mentioning, there has been success. there has been success in research. The research on the impact of armed conflict on children led to the recommendation to have a general comment on Article 22. Among other reasons, that general comment is now published. The continental study on mapping the situation of children on the move has led to the community to engage very many other viable alternatives to protect children on the move and in transit. We have also had the stock taking of aid protection mechanisms that was done last year, where the committee got a consultant to look at the various ways that children are protected in Africa. And it's a very good report. I think, Mike, I'll share all these studies with you in case there is